crew can sometimes get themselves into trouble. It's a subject we visited just maybe a few times here at the Red Eye, and one we doubt will disappear anytime soon. You see, we find ourselves thousands of miles from home, and somehow that distance can make it feel like the usual rules don't quite apply. Especially when you're running on no sleep, and the drinks are cheaper than they should be, and you are surrounded by people who might not exactly be the best influences. Now, there's no excuse for some behaviour, and we certainly don't want to sound like we condone it, but we will admit that there's always a certain amusement when these stories start doing the rounds. Told in hushed voices on the crew seats at 2 a.m, or over coffee in the crew room, growing legs with every retelling until you're no longer quite sure what is fact and what's been embellished somewhere along the line. So, with that in mind, we'll tell you that this week's story reached us here at the Red Eye as fact, straight from the mouth of someone who was there. But, as always, we haven't seen the evidence for ourselves, and so we'll just add our usual disclaimer here. We can't say for certain whether it's true, but we wouldn't be surprised if it was.
Doors to armed and cross-check. Come fly the Red Eye! Whoa! Welcome aboard the Red Eye.
London to Beijing, 2024. Dan just didn't get it. It was Christmas Eve. In fact, it was just minutes away from Christmas Day. Everyone on board must have known exactly what date they were booking when they chose this flight. So why did they all seem so miserable about being there? He had never seen such a fed-up group of passengers in his life. Or maybe, he thought as he walked carefully down the dim dial, he was expecting too much from them. After all, he had packed his Santa hat almost as soon as he'd been rostered the trip. He'd worn it from the moment he'd left his house, and he fully intended to keep it on until he reached his hotel room in Beijing. He had brought tinsel, he had brought gifts from home, ready to be opened later when he was alone. The other crew had brought decorations for the galleys too, and they were all determined to make the best of being away from home and away from their loved ones on Christmas Day. There was no point dwelling on it. After all, it was part of the job. If you were not senior enough to get leave, then you had just as much chance as anyone of working over the holidays. Thankfully, the rest of the crew were all of the same mindset. "I've got them," he announced as he made it into the back galley. "Yay!" said Courtney, grinning as she took the tray of Christmas dinners he had just collected from the front of the cabin from him and set them down on the side. It was only a couple of minutes away from midnight in the UK, and Christmas had already begun further east. If they were going to spend it at 38,000 feet, then they would at least have a turkey dinner with all the trimmings and pretend just for a moment that they were celebrating like everyone else. Sam picked up a set of cutlery and took one of the meals from the tray. Courtney did the same, peeling back the lid and scrunching up her face. "Wow, they're really pushing the boat out on this one," she said dryly. Inside, the small ceramic dish held one tiny sausage wrapped in a pale strip of bacon, a few thin slices of turkey, what looked like undercooked roast potatoes, and vegetables drowning in a pale sauce that was probably meant to be gravy. "Well, that was worth it," said Dan, wishing he'd stuck to the chicken goujons from the crew cart instead of making the effort to fetch these. "I don't care. I'm going in." He peeled back his own lid, stabbed the pig-in blanket with his fork and popped it straight into his mouth. It's actually not that bad," he said, chewing. "Could be worse. And probably the only bit of Christmas we're going to get in China. I don't even know if they celebrate it." "Oh no," said Courtney, smiling. "You'll be surprised. I was there last Christmas and it was actually really good. We'll definitely find some nice places to go out, I promise." The others exchanged glances, quietly reassured. None of them quite knew what to expect, but hearing it from someone who had already been there was enough. In fact, she added, I've already made an itinerary. I know some great places we can go if you fancy it. There were murmurs of agreement. Just because they were not at home, not drinking Prosecco with family at breakfast or unwrapping presents from under the tree, it didn't mean they had to miss Christmas altogether. In fact, Dan thought, the crew seemed to be like a fun bunch. And this might turn out to be one of the most memorable Christmases he had ever had. And it was. That afternoon, after a short nap, they gathered in the hotel lobby and, after a couple of drinks in a nearby bar, headed to the restaurant they had booked just down the street. The whole crew made it. 7 cabin crew and 3 pilots. The only ones missing were the Chinese crew who'd already gone home to their families. The captain, Rob, took his place at the head of the table, a Santa hat on his head and a relaxed smile on his face, helped along by the generous amount of red wine he had already worked his way through. He swayed ever so slightly as he raised his glass again to toast the occasion. The 2 first officers were young enough not to have wives or children waiting at home and happy to volunteer for a Christmas away. In fact, most of the crew were young and single. That was probably how it worked. The longer you stayed, the more settled life became, and the more likely you were to get the holidays off. Dinner was a typical Chinese affair, adjusted to their Western palates, but they had already had their attempt at turkey earlier, so no one minded. It was all washed down with plenty of Tsingtao, and the laughter was growing louder with each round. And, as Christmas Day edged towards its end, none of them were ready to stop their festivities. It might have been 11 o'clock at night here in China, but back home, it was still early afternoon, and their body clocks were wide awake and ready for more. "Let's go to a club I know," said Courtney as they settled the bill. Sounds good, agreed Joe, one of the first officers, looking at his 3-stripe counterpart. Are you coming, mate? Gary raised his glass. For sure. They looked at Rob, who gave a knowing shake of his head. No, he said with a small laugh. But if you're back soon, I've got a stash in my room. Feel free to come and help me drink it. I will hold you to that, said Joe, grinning. Moments later, they were piling into rickshaws outside, shouting and laughing as they sped through the busy streets. Even late at night, the city was alive. It was cold, but with their alcohol jackets on, no one seemed to notice. At the nightclub, they paid their way in and headed upstairs. Within minutes, Gary was up on the podium, dancing with the confidence of a 19-year-old on his first trip to Ibiza. The crew were in hysterics. It felt almost euphoric. The drinks kept flowing, the music thumping through them. And somewhere along the way, the plan not to stay for long and to return to the captain's room quietly disappeared. "I'm just going to the loo," Dan said eventually. He hadn't seen either of the pilots for a while and assumed they'd already slipped off. He was starting to flag slightly himself, if he were honest, and thought a quick break from the noise might help him reset. Sam followed him towards the back of the club where they found the toilets. They pushed the door open and both stopped dead. In front of them stood Gary, grinning, stood next to a life-size, decapitated polystyrene snowman. Its head was upside down in his hands, while Joe stood beside him, carefully scooping out the insides and tipping the excavated polystyrene balls into the bin as he went. "What the hell?" Dan laughed. "What are you doing?" "He wants to wear it," Gary said, glancing down at the head, completely serious. Joe glanced over, gave a small nod and carried on digging. In his hand was a silver spoon, and to this day, Dan has no idea where it come from. He was making good progress, though, already halfway through hollowing it out. "Right," Dan said, shaking his head. "I'll be out in a sec." He stepped into a cubicle, did what he needed to do, and then came back out to wash his hands, finding the 2 pilots were still fully committed to the project. He moved over to the hand dryer, putting his hands out and pressing the button, and instantly he regretted it. A strong blast of air shot straight out and tiny white polystyrene balls exploded outwards, flying out of the head, out of the bin, out of everywhere that they had been, swirling into the air like a blizzard inside the small room. For a few seconds, it was chaos. The particles spun and danced, filling the space, clinging to everything, hair, clothes, skin. And when the dryer finally stopped and the particles settled, all 4 of them stood frozen, covered head to toe in white. They looked at each other, and then slowly, as one, they turned toward the mirror. The sight that stared back at them was, to put it mildly, ridiculous. "I don't think you need the head anymore, mate," Dan said, trying not to laugh. "I think this look's got you covered." They tried brushing the polystyrene off, but the static only made it worse. Every attempt just pulled more back onto them, and eventually they gave up, embracing it completely. The 4 of them walked out the toilets in a line, still dusted in white, heading back toward their friends like some kind of festive disaster. "Oh my God!" The scream cut through the music as one of the girls spotted them approaching. The 4 of them stopped, shrugging, each waiting for someone else to explain their appearance. And while Joe eventually tried to explain the snowman, the plan to wear the head, and the hand dryer, the others just looked around and looked more confused. "So, tell me again, what happened?" asked one of the girls, completely confused by the look on her face. As Joe tried again to explain, Dan looked at her, struggling to place her. She wasn't Courtney, and he was pretty sure that she wasn't one of their crew either, and yet she looked familiar. Like someone he should recognise. It didn't take long to figure out that she was from another crew. In fact, there were a few of them in the club that night, due to fly home the next day, although apparently they'd all left and she hadn't been ready to call it a night yet. "I think I might head back," said Joe eventually, drained from the repeated explanation, still trying and failing to brush the polystyrene from his clothes. The others agreed. They were getting more than a few strange looks now, and it was becoming quite clear that what had been funny in the toilets, out here, just looked ridiculous. Outside, somehow, they managed to organise taxis and make their way back to the hotel, regrouping in the lobby a short while later. "Has anyone seen Gary?" Joe asked, looking around for his wingman and co-pilot. A few heads shook. No one had. "Well, he's a big boy," Dan said. "I'm sure he's made it back to his room." "Anyone remember what room Rob's in?" someone asked. "Oh, I do," said Joe, leading them towards the lift. On the 15th floor, they knocked on the captain's door. Nothing. They knocked again. Still nothing. Finally, with far more enthusiasm than necessary, Joe hammered on the door until it finally opened. Rob stood there, eyes bleary, clearly dragged from sleep, his lips stained with dried red wine. "I said an hour, you idiot, not 4. "Oh, come on, Rob, let us in," Joe grinned. "We're here for your stash." "Go away," Rob replied, although there was a hint of amusement in his voice. The door shut firmly. "Well, that's that," Dan said, turning to the others. "We all knew that plan was a lost cause." "Oh, I'm not ready for bed," Courtney said, eyes still bright, her energy not even close to fading. "Not even slightly. We can go to someone else's room." All eyes turned to Joe, the next in the hierarchy to hold the room party. "Not a chance," he said quickly. "I've learnt that lesson the hard way." They turned to the girl from the other crew. "You can't come to mine," she said immediately. "My boyfriend's asleep in there." "Your boyfriend?" Courtney raised an eyebrow. "Where was he tonight?" "Bed early," she shrugged, leaning drunkily on Joe. "Couldn't keep up." "Right," Dan said slowly. "Well, You can come to mine, I guess. As long as no one trashes it, and if I fall asleep, that's your cue to leave. There were murmurs of agreement. But we should probably find Gary, Joe added, putting his arm around the girl to support her. She gazed up at him drunkenly. He's gone to get booze. Dan glanced at his phone. That was the problem out here. Wi-Fi was hit and miss, and half the usual apps barely worked. He turned to ask Joe if he knew Gary's room number, but stopped mid-sentence. Joe and the new girl were suddenly very close. In fact, there was barely any space between them at all now, their conversation clearly over as things shifted into something much more physical. Dan frowned and quickly looked away, and then glanced at Sam, subtly nodding back toward them. "Thought she had a boyfriend," he muttered under his breath. Sam just shrugged. "Well, we still need to find Gary," someone said, a little too loudly, as if deliberately ignoring what was happening, "especially if he's got booze." Let's just go back to mine," Dan said quickly. "We can call down and get the operator to put us through to his room." He turned and started walking, glancing back over his shoulder for a split second, and then immediately wishing he hadn't. "Well, that escalated quickly," Sam said, falling into step beside him. "Certainly did," he replied quietly. Whatever they were doing, it was clearly private, and none of their business. Either way, it was definitely time to leave. At the lift, the doors slid open, and Gary stepped out, still dusted in polystyrene, a bag of drinks swinging from his hand. "We're heading to my room," Dan said, holding the door open as the others piled in. 1527. "Be down in a bit," Gary replied. "I just need to grab my charger." He turned and walked back the way they'd come. Dan opened his mouth, half tempted to warn him that he might be walking into something awkward, and then thought better of it as the lift doors slid shut. He'd figure it out soon enough. Gary never made it to Dan's room that night. They assumed, wrongly, that he'd simply gone to bed. When Captain Rob picked up the phone to the manager the next evening, he had a feeling that he already knew what this was about. His first officers had already regaled him with their antics from the first night over beers on the second, and he'd been relieved that he'd gone to bed if he were honest. He was just like them once, finding hilarity in the most ridiculous of things, but he struggled these days to find things quite as funny as he used to. These things had a habit of coming back and biting you on the arse, and he had learned his lesson some time ago now.
"Sorry to bother you, Rob,"
Marco started.
"but I have to chase something up that's been reported about your crew."
"Oh, God," Rob groaned, wishing he'd been wrong. "Oh, don't worry, I know what this is about," he said.
"You do?"
"Yeah, that bloody snowman." How the nightclub had managed to trace it back to them was a mystery, but he wasn't exactly shocked that they had. You couldn't go around just damaging other people's property like that, especially not here. The line went quiet for a beat, and then Marco spoke.
"I'm sorry, mate, but I don't know anything about a snowman. It was about the 2 first officers on your crew and some inappropriate conduct."
He paused, and Rob looked at the receiver in his hand. Well, that was unexpected, he thought. They certainly hadn't mentioned that story. "Sorry, mate," he said after a while. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're going to have to fill me in."
"Your 2 first officers, Joe and Gary,"
Marco said, his voice lifted,
"shagging right outside your room on the first night you got there."
Rob's eyes shot up as an unwelcome image forced its way into his head. He coughed, and then, eventually, after several failed attempts, he found his words. "What? Each other?" he asked. He hadn't seen that come in. He was sure they'd been chatting about girls on the way over. There was a small laugh on the other end.
No, there were 3 people involved, and the hotel caught it all on CCTV. In high definition. They're really not happy about it. Not happy at all.
Good Lord! It was all Rob could think of to say. He wasn't a prude. He'd heard it all in his decades of flying and done a few things he hadn't been proud of himself, but he hadn't seen this coming. Outside my room, you say?
Yep.
Like, in the corridor?
Yep. Right outside your door.
Rob's lip curled as he felt momentarily affronted. What if he'd come out of his room for something? Or if the hotel had presumed it was him? My 2 pilots and who? A girl?
Yep.
A crew member?
Yep.
And you're sure it was my lads? He asked, hopefully, praying for their sakes and the sake of the flight home that there was a chance it wasn't.
Oh, yes,
said Marco.
Definitely. Me and Frank can confirm after watching the tape that it was definitely them.
Rob held his forehead in his palm, shaking his head slowly as he leaned back in his chair. There were some things you just didn't do, and especially not somewhere like China. They were lucky, incredibly lucky, that they hadn't been arrested. He let out a long, steady breath, already picturing what came next. The awkward conversations, the formal meetings, the quiet but pointed questions from people who already knew the answers. Investigations, disciplinaries, reports written and rewritten until every detail had been picked apart. And the fallout, not just for those involved, but for everyone connected to it. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to shut out the images that kept forcing their way back into his mind. It was the kind of thing that you couldn't unsee once you knew about it. Good Lord, he muttered once again. It really was all he could think of to say. Well, we are assured that there was an investigation that followed this incident, and that there were repercussions for those people who had been involved. And, as is usually the case when something unprecedented happens, the story of what happened in a corridor in China soon took on a life of its own at the airline. It became one of those tales that gets passed around quietly on jump seats in the early hours, retold in crew rooms and in bars across the world, each version picking up its own little twist along the way. So, was it just the 3 of them? Or was it 4? Did it happen in the corridor? Or did they make it back to a room? Did the girl get sacked and the boys not? Or was that just an add-on that came to the story later? Whatever the truth was, the 3 involved became known as something along the lines of the Beijing Bonkers. And while they are, apparently, still flying, we suspect they'd much rather their moment of notoriety had faded into the background by now. Still, whether they like it or not, they left behind a story in that corridor, outside Captain Rob's room that night. And more importantly, they left behind a lesson. And there, dear listeners, is the moral of this story. No matter how far from home you are, no matter how different the world feels around you, or how drunk you are, someone, somewhere, is probably watching. So don't do anything you might regret later. Because what happens on a layover rarely ever stays there. The Red Eye podcast is written by Kaylee Kay, narrated and produced by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Red Eye podcast. You guys are why we do this. We love the stories that you have, and we love telling you the stories that people share with us. To help us reach more people and get the podcast really out there, we would really appreciate it if you left a review. It just helps our podcast be a little bit more visible. Thank you.